You're listening to What It's Like with Luce, a podcast highlighting ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'm your host Lucy Norris, and on today's episode, I'm chatting to an Irish actor and stand-up comedian. Spending his childhood in Monaghan, this week's guest didn't grow up looking for a life in the spotlight. Quite shy and introverted, he loved to read and was extremely curious about the world. Going to college, he decided he wanted to change as a person and took up debating, where he got his first taste of what stand-up comedy could be like. Realising he had the ability to make his peers laugh, about 6 months after graduating, he set up one of Ireland's first ever comedy clubs with 3 friends in the upstairs room of the International Bar. Taking it as far as he could in Ireland, his next move was to London, where everything changed. Being approached to audition for a new TV series, Father Ted, was only the beginning, and a few stand-up tours, further TV roles such as D.I. Jack Mooney in Death in Paradise, led him to make quite the name for himself on the world stage. Sharing his story thus far, here's what it's like to be Ardal O'Hanlon. Welcome, Ardal. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. How I like to kick everything off, if you don't mind, I like to ask all my guests about what it was like for them growing up. I know you're from Monaghan. Did you always want to be a performer, or what were you like as a kid?
I definitely didn't want to be a performer. I was possibly quite a shy kid, I would say. I love sport and I love outdoor activity, but I was very bookish.
Okay.
And so I was always drawn to, fiction. I read everything I could get my hands on when I was a kid. I used to even come home from school. Even when I was in primary school, I used to come home at lunchtime and read the paper. So I was a very old-fashioned kid. I would read it from cover to cover. I would read all the news, all the sport. I would read the small ads. I would read the TV listings. I just wanted to be informed, and I was curious. So, and I read all the books in the house. Both my mum and my aunt, my Aunt Maura, were very bookish people. So there was always lots of books, lots of, mostly children's novels, like children's classics, Chronicles of Narnia, that kind of stuff. And I even read the encyclopedia.
Oh, wow.
I'm sure I'm coming across a very pretentious little twit, but I just read everything I could get my hands on, and I loved the atlas. I had a little pocket atlas that I carried around everywhere, and I knew all the capitals. I was a right little know-all. I mean, people must have hated me. I know that now, but I knew all the flags of the different countries. So I think, while I wasn't antisocial, or I wouldn't say like chronically shy or anything, I lived a lot of my childhood in my head. I had imaginary friends. I had imaginary pen pals dotted around the world in strategic locations. So it was a bit odd.
But I think that's such an interesting contrast that you mentioned there, that you were quite shy and you sort of kept to yourself as a kid, considering what you do now for a living. So how did that come about? I know that you studied communication in college, but how did that transition happen from being quite an introverted person who just really wanted to inform himself on the world to then taking the stage in comedy?
Well, I mean, I was always drawn to comedy. Growing up, I quite liked Laurel and Hardy and stuff like that. At school, I suppose the people I gravitated towards were, not necessarily loudmouths or obviously funny people, but, there were people, like-minded people, I guess. And we always had a good laugh, and I think when I got to college then, and I think I was quite determined when I left school and before I went to university, I was quite determined to change as a person. I saw it as a great opportunity to change and sort of, to come out of my shell a little. And, I in my first year in DCU, or it was then called NIHE Dublin, I started debating with some friends of mine, like just joining the debating society, which was, it was a big leap for me, but I enjoyed it. I relished it. I got a real thrill from it. And, my instinct was just to sort of try to make mainly my friends laugh, my immediate circle, but, the wider audience as well. And I realized that like it kind of worked for me, you know, and I can't really put my finger on why it did. But it, you know, it was just some, it was just like a, I don't know, university is a great place for lots of reasons, you know, people who are particularly into the courses, you know, particularly the professions like engineering and medicine and so on, and law, you know, there's obviously a very good reason to be in university. But for a lot of people who aren't quite sure what they want to do, university is just a great, I don't know, period of transition. You know, it's a place to really find your feet as a human being, you know, to expand um, your knowledge, you know, your reading, and to be exposed to, you know, lots of different people from different walks of life, and, you know, exposed to new ideas. So, you know, I think I was very much one of that, you know, fell into that category of people that, you know, who saw university just as a great, I don't know, time out from life where you could just, you know, express yourself.
And so when did you first come across stand up, or when did you do your first gig?
So that would have been maybe 6 months after I left college. I mean, you know, the debates were kind of like stand up. I mean, you know, like in hindsight, they felt very like stand up in terms of you're going up there, with, you know, your 10 minutes material or whatever, and you're trying to get people to laugh. So, you know, so I had some sort of grounding in it. But I think I had met people in college. I mean, the specific people I met in college, Barry Murphy and Kevin Gildea, who are both still very active and very successful in comedy today. Um, we had this notion that we were going to set up a comedy club when we left college. I mean, back then, I think it was 1987 when I left. There weren't really many job opportunities for people who had graduated in this communications course that I did. You know, I didn't really want to emigrate like so many of my peers were doing at the time. So, you know, we thought we'd stay at home and we'd try and generate something for ourselves. So we hit upon this like idiotic plan to set up a comedy club. And we went around a few different pubs in town, and we settled on the International Bar. They had a tiny room upstairs, which, you know, it wouldn't be too embarrassing if it wasn't full, you know. And we did a monthly gig to begin with. You know, a few other people joined us, people like Carl McDermott, Dermot Carmody, people like that at the very beginning. And we just put on these little shows for our friends, you know, and we had little sketches and little monologues, and it was great, you know, and it was very exciting. So, you know, we wanted to emulate places like the Comedy Store in London, which were, you know, I suppose a mecca for comedians. And, you know, it was clear that this alternative comedy, as it was known in those days, was a big deal in Britain, and it had really taken off. And news of that was filtering back to us. And occasionally you'd see guys who looked like us appearing on British TV, on BBC and ITV at the weekends. They'd come on there shuffling, you know, they just looked scruffy and sort of not very professional. And, you know, they were talking about the same sort of stuff that we were talking about. So that was all very exciting. So I guess we were just trying to emulate that in a fairly amateurish kind of cack-handed way to begin with. But over the course of a few months, like, it became a thing, and, you know, the monthly gig became a weekly gig, and then more people joined in. People from advertising in Dublin, people like Alex Lyons and Jerry Kennedy joined in, and, you know, so there was a bit of a scene emerging then, you know, and even though we were making absolutely no money and the prospects were very, very limited, it was just an exciting little scene to be part of. And, you know, it was something that got you out of bed in the morning, and, you know, so that was my very, very humble beginnings in stand-up.
Yeah, it seems like you guys were, I suppose, pioneers of the comedy scene in Ireland, because it doesn't sound like there was too much going on before you took that leap. So what was it like in those days when you were first starting up? Did people receive it well? I know you said it grew after a few months, but in the beginning, what was the state of, I suppose, the comedy area in Ireland?
Yeah, it was a bit of a desert, I think, comedy in Ireland. I mean, you know, there were always comedians. There was always people doing stuff like Dermot Morgan, who I you know, ironically ended up working with later on. Like, he was a sort of a maverick in comedy, where he was more of an impressionist and a political comic, an occasional columnist in the newspaper. So I was very aware of him, but, you know, it wasn't really my cup of tea at the time. And then even, you know, Frank Kelly, who was also in the show Father Ted that I worked on later in life, you know, I remember watching him as a kid. he had a satirical show on TV called Hall's Pictorial Weekly, which was sort of RT's, I think, only foray into comedy in since its inception at that time. And, you know, we thought that was really funny. And again, they were kind of larger than life grotesque characters that sort of Frank was doing. So, you know, there was always comedy and we were always aware of it. And then you had more of the traditional kind of cabaret style comedy, people like Hal Roach and Noel Vizi, you know, playing in the hotel bars, mainly to American tourists and stuff like that. So you had that type of thing as well. So, you know, we were always aware of that. And people like Niall Tobin, who ploughed a lonely furrow as well, you know, but these were kind of one-offs. There was no real comedy scene. They were very much part of something else, like they might have gone on before a band, you know, or, you know, part of a cabaret show. So I suppose where we were coming from, like what made it slightly different was that it was very much modeled on this alternative comedy thing that was coming out of Britain. And you know, it was open season. I mean, you could create whatever character you wanted and you could talk about whatever you want. That was the crucial thing. You weren't bound by any sorts of conventions or any sorts of tropes, you know, like, you know, predictable or very traditional kind of joke patterns or joke conventions, you know. So, you know, it seemed to me like a very kind of new and fresh medium. And it seemed to me that it was attracting a different type of character as well. You know, people who, you know, it was kind of like people who would go into indie bands, you know, or going into comedy now for a change. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. It sounds really like it was a really interesting time and a really exciting time as well. And obviously you mentioned Father Ted there, which I don't think anyone could speak to you without asking you about it. So how did that come about and what was that like?
I kind of felt that by about sort of the mid-90s, I had gone as far as I could in Dublin if I was going to take this career seriously. And we were doing okay, like 5 or 6 years after we started, like we were doing fine. We were reasonably polished. We were getting a few more shows in colleges and places like that. We did the odd sketch on RTE shows. But, you know, you couldn't make a living and most people weren't aware of our existence. So I, like a lot of people, moved to London sort of around 94, I think it was. And very quickly things started happening for me. I entered a few competitions which I won, kind of newcomer stand-up competitions, and I was getting quite a lot of notice and getting quite a lot of gigs around the country over there. And, you know, eventually, you know, because comedy was kind of booming in those days, it was big business. So all the TV companies were circling around the comedians and around the festivals, particularly the Edinburgh Festival. So I just got this approach one day from the writers, Arthur and Graham. They came up to me after one of my stand-up shows in London, and they just said, "Oh, you know," and it was just very casually dropped into the conversation. It wasn't an offer or anything, or you know, it wasn't anything I took seriously. They just mentioned that they were working on this TV show, which turned out to be Father Ted, and that they had me in mind for one of the characters, and that was my first inkling about it. And it wasn't until about 6 months later that I was called in for an audition. And I'd sort of forgotten about the conversation by then. And I went in for the audition, not expecting anything, because you don't, like, you know, I wasn't really, you know, I didn't consider myself to be an actor in those days. Like I was, you know, very busy with my stand-up show. So I didn't, you know, I really didn't give the audition a second thought either until another few weeks later, I get called back to a second audition. And this time it was with Dermot, who they had settled on as Father Ted. So they put myself and Dermot together to see if we had any on-screen chemistry. And we got on great from the very start. He had a very odd career up to that point, you know. You know, and I think he always felt like that he'd been badly treated by Irish television. And you know, this was for him was a massive deal. You know, it was a break in the UK where he had no profile whatsoever. I don't think he'd ever done shows in Britain or anything. So this was a big departure for him as well. And he didn't consider himself to be an actor either. So we kind of hit it off immediately on that level alone. You know, that we were sort of outsiders in this business. And then a month or so later, we start shooting, and it's incredibly exciting. Like I'd done so little television before then, so it was all new to me. And it was a real learning curve, but it was great fun from the very start. I mean, the scripts were always very funny. Cast got on great, crew were fantastic. So yeah, it was, I suppose it was a godsend in lots of ways.
Yeah, and did you ever have any reservations about moving over into more permanent TV work and leaving stand up behind for the moment? Or was it always just, you were certain that's the direction you wanted to go in once they offered you the place?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It was always a sort of a yin and a yang. There was a kind of a thing in comedy in those days. Like comedy was a very po-faced to be in many ways. There was a kind of a purist attitude in comedy that you weren't to sell out in any way whatsoever. That you definitely couldn't do ads, you couldn't do sitcom, you couldn't even do chat shows. You had to be this almost live this Spartan existence, where you were a warrior, like a comedy warrior. And like a lot of the alternative movement was very overtly political as well. You did have to resist that, resist that peer pressure. I mean, I knew the show was great, and I knew it was a really lucky break. So I absolutely jumped at it. I mean, I certainly had no qualms about doing Father Ted at the time. I didn't know it was going to be successful or anything. I just knew it was going to be good and that we were going to enjoy it, and that was really the only criteria that mattered. After that, then you're not in control of things. That's what I learned very quickly. You don't really, unless you're a very strong-minded person, with clear goals in life, and I was never that person. Your career kind of almost takes off without you. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're pushed and pulled in different directions, and you're always trying to navigate it as best as you can. I guess it's a bit like a surfer. You're trying to stay on the board. And um I did turn down a lot of things, because I was conscious that stand up I considered myself to be a stand up comedian first and foremost, not an actor. But I did want to. I was very tickled by the whole acting thing, and I also wanted to write, long form, as well. I was always torn between different projects, and also torn by, the very first principle, which was to do as little as possible. I mean, this was the whole point of doing comedy in the first place, was that it was a sort of a fairly, easygoing kind of, kind of a bohemian existence, for want of a better term. I don't like using that word, but I can't think of a better one at the moment. So like every human being, you're I suppose you're torn by all sorts of conflicting points of view about everything. So yeah, I tried to combine stand up and television as best as I could, and tried to pick and choose as best as I could. And I think I was reasonably successful with that over the years. I mean, I don't have any major regrets about any of the shows I did. I mean, every show has its merits in some way. Even if it's like a rubbish show, it's still, the experience is always great. So yeah.
I guess in hindsight, looking back on being such a huge part of a show that did so well worldwide, is there ever any, I don't really know what the right word to use is, not dangers, but downsides, I guess, to being attached to such a well-known character? Did it bring any problems into your career later on, as you were trying to move on to do other projects, as you said, to write, to go back to stand up? Did you ever battle with trying to detach yourself from Dougal at any points?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably be lying if I said I didn't. Uh, I, but overall, I mean, taking everything into account, I have absolutely no problems with Father Ted, or with the character of Father Dougal, or the way it's kind of hung around me, for decades. Honestly, I mean, it's just been a fantastic experience, and you know, to be even a small part of like television history is it's a great feeling. It's a great consolation at times. Now during COVID, when everyone's feeling pretty uncertain about everything, it is nice to look back and remember very fondly being part of that experience. But there was certainly a time, I would say maybe in the 2 or 3 years after Father Ted, when we were all trying to move on, that it became not impossible but tricky. Like you'd be doing your stand-up show, and um, you know my stand-up show, like, it evolved, away from the Dougal persona, um, quite dramatically in some ways. And I think the audience maybe resisted that in some ways. I think people were coming to see me because they wanted to see maybe some version of Dougal. Now, this may be all in my head. The shows went perfectly well. It's just that I was a little frustrated at the time. I felt in terms of my stand-up, I wasn't able to push it to the places I wanted to push it at the time. And then also in terms of other TV roles, the kind of, in fairness, the kind of thing I was being asked to do was always some twist on the Dougal character. But I was always able to rationalize that on one level, in that, like, I didn't, I suppose on one hand, I'm delighted to be asked to do anything, because when you start out in comedy not expecting anything, everything is a bit of a bonus. So yeah, it was, I was always quite philosophical about it, to be honest with you, and I was always quite a patient man too. Like, I was never in a big hurry. I didn't have like boxes that I wanted to tick or anything like that in terms of a TV career. So I always kind of went with the flow to some extent, and picked and choose as far as is practical. You're only offered a certain amount of things, so you don't always have an awful lot to pick and choose from. So yeah, and over time, like, while Father Ted is still very still very popular, obviously, and it seems to have stood the test of time quite well. I feel I've been able to move on, in all sorts of ways, particularly in terms of my stand-up. I'm kind of, I've just, just before COVID, I just came off quite a lengthy tour in the UK, and it was probably, probably my favorite show that I've ever done, in terms of the material I was doing and the audience response and everything like that. So, and then, I've had quite a few TV roles in the meantime, and indeed theatre roles that, have put a fair bit of daylight between the Dougal character and, where I'm at now.
Yeah, and one of those TV roles was Death in Paradise. I love that show. I think it's so good. I'm such a fan of crime TV, but a bit too much. But what was that like, going from, as you said, a variety of different roles in different shows, but all that were slightly centered around a more comedic persona, to something like Death in Paradise, which was quite mainstream in the crime area. How was that shift, and how did you find that experience?
I kind of enjoyed it. I mean, the thing about Death in Paradise, I suppose, that sort of marks it slightly apart from other crime dramas, or is that it has a lightness of tone. So I think I
Yeah.
was able to bring that to it, or I think that's why they sort of were considered me for that role. Um, it's it's a show that I suppose it, it's got a it's a cheesy kind of show in some ways, and that's part of its charm. It has a slight, there is a slight tongue-in-cheek element to it. So it's a difficult balance to strike, because it has to be grounded in a crime scene, but you kind of want to have your cake and eat it as well. You want it to be kind of quite comedic in places. Um, I suppose just in terms of the job itself, it was like, it's, on the surface, it's very exotic. You're being asked to spend half the year in the Caribbean. There's worse places to spend your life, I guess.
Yeah.
So, the experience was great for me. By the time I was asked to do that job, my kids were quite grown up, so it was an easy enough decision to make. I think if my kids were younger, it might have been tougher, but I had the blessing of my wife and family, so I was able to go off and make the most of it. I think the other thing about a role like that, which is significantly different from some of the more obviously comedic roles that I did in the past, is that there was huge responsibility. Like, I don't know, there are hour-long dramas. The lead detective, in my case, the Jack Mooney character, is in every scene. You're shooting, what is, an impossible schedule in impossible weather conditions. So you have to make a lot of decisions. So you learn very quickly as an actor. I mean, you're always learning as an actor, obviously, but in a show like that, where you're so involved in every scene and you're working with so many different actors and so many different directors, um, you know, and you have to make so many decisions, like tiny little decisions, but all day long. So, you know, it's a real crash course in acting, you know, and you're quickly found out, you know, your range is quickly found out, how limited it is, you know. But so I really enjoyed that. I really loved that side of it, the challenge of it. I mean, I love the lifestyle as well out there. It was great, but unsustainable over the long term. Like I did 3 series of it. Well, kind of, you know, 3.5 series of it. And, you know, it really does take its toll eventually. So, you know, I defy anyone to last as long as I did in that role. But it was a great experience. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I always think it's so interesting to hear, you know, kind of a behind the scenes outlook from actors on their jobs, because I feel like everyone thinks it's such an easy job. You know, you just have to stand there, read some lines, and that's it. But as you demonstrated there, there's so much more that goes into it. Um, and I guess
Yeah,
the
but I
other,
should stress, Lucy, sorry to interrupt, but
no
I
worries.
should stress that it is an easy job compared to most
No,
other jobs
but
on the
you
planet.
know,
But at the time, it doesn't seem easy. And actors are really excellent at moaning. I mean, they're better than anyone I know at moaning, and they will moan about everything. But sorry to interrupt.
no, no, not at all. But what I was gonna say is I'm sure there is a lot of pressure just in the lifestyle in general too. And as you were saying earlier, you reach a certain point where you lose control of what's gonna happen next because things are happening so fast. So, you know, obviously you're from Ireland, and I feel like we're quite a conservative country, you know, we don't celebrate success too much or too extravagantly. So how did you find the shift in lifestyle in terms of becoming, you know, quote unquote famous with your work? Did you ever struggle with having so many people watch you, or did that not really phase you?
Um, yeah, from time to time it did, I guess. I think this profession, I think it requires a certain temperament. I think you do have to have a fairly cool head. I think you do have to be patient. I think you have to be philosophical. It's not to say that everyone in the profession is like that. Um, I think it's helped me to sort of not ever have unrealistic expectations. Um, you know, and I think to have sort of like a reasonable self-awareness about the limits of your own abilities and things like that. I always think happiness is, you know, you need to you need to have a sort of a graph and figure out, you know, your expectations and your abilities, and you know, as long as you keep that gap fairly narrow, you won't be too unhappy. But if you've got unrealistic expectations, you'll be very unhappy, you know. And I always feel that, you know, that the more you lower your expectations, the happier you'll be. And that, you know, that goes for everything, not just career. You know, there are like, I don't know, for a relatively shy person, being in the spotlight, I guess is something that you have to come to terms with. In a sense, your career is happening very much in public. You know, you're going to be exposed to scrutiny um, often. It's not always going to be pleasant. You know, you're going to have intrusion into your private life, which is not always going to be welcome. So, you know, but you learn, and like I think the advantages of having a decent career in, let's call it show business as a shorthand, is you know, outweigh the negatives, really. Ultimately, I think, uh, you know, I think in any walk of life you have to sort of, you know, it's always a balancing act, isn't it? You know, you have to try and keep a level head. You have to try and keep grounded. The people around you will help you do that. You know, so I don't know. I've like overall, I can't really complain. You know, about anything. I do, naturally enough, because I'm a human being. But really, really, I mean, you know, there's been times, I suppose. I mean, the times I've been most low in terms of career, you know, were to do with sort of press intrusion. I would say that, you know, where your words are twisted, where you come across as a fool or worse. Um, you know, I guess that can be kind of hurtful sometimes, and just embarrassing, really. You know, it's just, you know, you know, you might feel slightly humiliated, but you know, it only lasts a week or two, and then, you know, most people have forgotten about it. So there's been a few incidents like that over the years, which have been very uncomfortable, I'd say. But, you know, as I say, you do get used to it. You become a bit more wary. Maybe it does change you slightly.
Yeah.
Not quite as trusting of strangers as you might like to be. You know, and just wary in your dealings with media generally. So, but, you know, again, that's, you know, again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, you know, not to be shooting your mouth off all the time. But as a comic, you sort of reserve the right to shoot your mouth off, I suppose. You know.
And then do you think that having been a comedian first, which I feel like you have to have such a thick skin to be a comedian and stand up there and tell jokes, it must be, well, to me, it would be the scariest thing ever. Do you think that that helped you in terms of being able to take criticism from the press or not really care what people think because you're putting yourself out there every night on stage?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely toughens you up. There's no doubt about that. And I know early in my career, like, you know, I've always felt that I was, you know, like overcoming sort of this kind of shyness and things like that as well. So I always felt that it was harder for me than for other people who are more naturally outgoing and gregarious and everything. Um, but you know, I always sought out really tough gigs. Like I would always do the most horrible shows imaginable. Um, you know, I would I would do anything just to get the experience of it and to, you know, and to become more resilient and everything else. And so yeah, I do think it toughens you up. You know, as a comedian, you do feel like you know, you do feel quite battle hardened. Um, you know, by I suppose, to use the boxing analogy, you know, getting into the ring every night and um, you know, facing whatever's put in front of you. So yeah, I mean, it definitely toughens you up. Um, but then, you know, comedians are notoriously insecure people as well. So I'm always I'm always intrigued by the whole notion of confidence. I think it's such an interesting area. You know, some of the most apparently confident people you meet are clearly not, are clearly anything but.
Yeah.
They're what they're doing is actually compensating for a dreadful lack of self-confidence. So, and I think comedians are a strange breed, you know, but I'm very drawn to them because, you know, they're obviously very curious people who, you know, who think deeply about life, even if what they say doesn't appear to be very profound. I mean, you know, they're trying to make sense of the world around them and trying to make sense of their own lives. You know, so they're quite engaging folk.
Obviously you tour as a comedian as well, which I can imagine is a pretty hectic time. So how does touring compare to life on set for you, and which do you prefer as well?
It's really hard to say. I mean, like I am so lucky to have both options. You know, I toured recently, and like I said earlier, like I think it was probably the most enjoyable tour I've ever had. So I quite enjoy it. I mean, it's daunting in ways. You're spending a lot of time on your own. You're out there on stage on your own. You know, you're standing or falling on what you say. Uh, you know, it's challenging, but uh, I don't know. I mean, you know, I think I know what I'm doing now. You know, I have a fair idea of what to expect. You know, when you go to a place, and you know, I really had no, and I do enjoy the traveling aspect of it actually. So, you know, believe it or not, like, you know, most of like this year, like in January, I toured Asia. I toured
Oh, wow.
7 spectacular cities in Asia, and you know that, like, you know, when I wouldn't have done that otherwise if it wasn't for the stand-up show. So it's a fantastic way to see the world, you know, where you spend the day exploring the place, learning about the place, you know, getting to know the local comedians on the ground as well, and likewise touring around Britain. You know, you're going to these fantastic cities and towns around the UK with their history and buildings and museums and, you know, and everything else. So there's so much to learn and so much to pick up and so much to see around it. So if you can build that into your day, you know that it's going to enrich the whole touring experience. And I suppose the big key change for me over the years is that I don't agonize about it as much, about the show itself, as much as I used to. You know, in my early days as a stand-up, like when I was touring for the first time, I found the whole experience almost overwhelming. You were fine on stage, bizarrely enough. Like, you know, once you step onto the stage, all your nerves disappear. you thrive on it. But it's the before and after that I used to find quite a struggle. But now I don't really. I mean, it's not that big a push for me now to get up on a stage. I feel I've kind of got over all that kind of angst that I used to have about it. Now, having said that, it's really interesting during lockdown. I quite like the idea that I'm not under that sort of stress. I'm under lots of different types of stresses, as we all are, but I'm not under that stress. So my body's not going through that, and it is quite interesting. I mean, like the nerves or whatever you want to call it, like it is very physical. It takes a physical toll on you live performing, and the whole anxiety around live performing. And even if you don't put a name on it, at the time, like I do know that the last few months of not touring and not even gigging in any way at all, has probably been a welcome break. Um, where you're not traveling, always traveling, always wondering where you have to be, and then having to get up on a stage in front of a big bunch of people. So I don't know. It's quite interesting, but I do kind of miss it. But
Yeah.
but at the same time, I think I'm doing my mind and my body a favor by not doing it.
Yeah, it must have been quite a shock initially, I'd say, for your body to just relax for the time being and not have to be anywhere. The other thing it must have been different for you. But as you said, you cross over into so many different cultures whenever you travel, which I'd say is absolutely amazing, but also, can take its toll, as you said. But the one thing I think is really interesting about comedy is the way your material will translate. I don't know if you know Trevor Noah, the comedian. He's South
Yes.
African.
Yes.
So I used to live in Africa, and when I watched him there, because I was aware of the culture there, I got the humor, and it was very funny. But then I feel like when he went to America, he had to change it up a bit to relate to the American audience. And just personally, I felt like it kind of took a bit of a knock because it had to be a bit more politically correct. So do you ever struggle with trying to get your material to translate when you do travel on tour?
Yeah, there is a certain amount of adjustment, all right. Like, because I live in Dublin, I try out my material in Dublin in small clubs around town, and in front of my wife and kids, who are Irish. So, and then when I go to the UK, where most of my work is, I do have to make these subtle adjustments. So I kind of have to go and try it out over there as well. And it's always interesting to me, and I still haven't cracked the code yet. Why some things work and some things don't. I mean, I think I've always been careful in terms of the writing process, not to overload the material with too many specific cultural references to Ireland, or you do want it to have an Irish sensibility, of course, which is my sensibility. You want it to have an Irish character and tone as well. And I come from the border region, so that's going to be a fairly deadpan tone. The humor is going to be fairly dark in places. But so I was always very conscious, at the writing stage, that this, I want this to travel, and I want people anywhere in the world to relate to this. I suppose for me, the main place is Britain. Will they get it? So you do have to kind of chisel away at it. I think that's the thing. You don't really have to change anything dramatically, but you have to sort of you have to tinker with it all the time until you just get it right. I mean, most of the themes are universal. You're going to be talking about relationships, I don't know, raising children, politics. You're going to be talking about the minutiae of everyday life, and I really think, that experience is universal. Those themes are universal. Religion, we're all very immersed in American culture, so we can all touch on that as well. We can touch on Brexit, we can touch on Trump, we can, so yeah, it's always traveled pretty well overall. Like I'd say in terms of like the Irish show and the British show, you might change 10% at most.
And then obviously throughout the whole of your career, you've had such massive success. So I'd be curious to know if you did have a personal definition of what success means to you in your life.
Well, I think it has to be taken in the round. I've never viewed like the accumulation of material wealth as success. I've never viewed like a very, a very popular television show as being a great measure of success either. I mean, I think it's all about the relationships you build during the career, about the experiences you have during the career. For me, like, variety was always very important in terms of, stretching yourself this way and that way. And, I've always tried to push myself, without overdoing it. That's another thing as well. Working very, very hard, again, would not, to me, be a great indicator of success. That's a slight failing. I would go as far as to argue. I think you've got to get that work-life balance absolutely right. Success for me is really more bound up with, I don't know, family, social life. Like I play tennis now. That's really my only yardstick. My only yardstick for success at the moment is did I win my tennis match yesterday? So it's getting all those things right as well. Is really important. It's interesting, that I would be most synonymous with that show, Father Ted, and I guess people would see that as a great success, and I absolutely see that as a great success as well. But I would have done other shows that would not have been as critically acclaimed or as popular or as enduring, but they would be, to me, they would be just as much as a success because of the experience I had while making it. And, when you're in a brilliant show, you don't even have to be brilliant because the show itself is brilliant. When you're in a show that isn't so great, you have to pull out more stops. You have to be better to make that show as good as it can be. So, and that's what I mean by that. So you could be in a show that doesn't get any of the kudos that a show like Father Ted gets. But, it's very successful on a number of metrics.
And then I just have one more question for you, and I'm going to let you get on with your day. If I put your 10-year-old self in front of you now, having been through everything you've been through, both in your career and also just life in general, what's the biggest piece of advice you would give that 10-year-old self moving forward?
Wow, that's hard. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I always, my first piece of advice to anyone, including my 10-year-old self, would be not to listen to any of my advice. I'm not a good role model, really. Yeah, I mean, well, I would say is to be curious. I mean, that's the main thing. I think curiosity will get you an awful long way. There's also a certain humility and curiosity, I think, where you don't have all the answers yourself. You don't know everything. Some 10-year-olds I know think they know it all. They don't. So just to be curious and read a lot. Like, I think that's possibly not the most popular thing in the world to say to 10-year-olds nowadays, but read books, get stuck in.
Yeah, I love that. And I just want to say thank you so much for giving up your time to chat to me. I really appreciate it. And it's been so interesting to hear your story. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Cheers.
Thank you so much for listening. And as always, please rate, share, and leave a comment if you like what you hear. And don't forget to follow @WhatIt'sLikePod on Instagram and Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. I'll be back on Thursday with more inspiring stories, but for now, this has been What It's Like with Luce.